All right.
Thanks, Sierra.
Welcome everyone to Generation Schools Network, SEL forum that we do monthly. Today, we are going to be talking about trauma-informed teaching. And yes, this is part one, because there will be a part two next month. And part one today, we are laying the foundation to create the general understanding of what trauma-informed teaching is, with some strategies and ideas and collaboration. But in part two next month, we will have additional information and dig deeper and dive deeper. So be sure to sign up for that one as well. Go ahead, Zach. So Zoom logistics, as we know in this world of virtual trainings and meetings, just make sure that if you are able and in a place where it's safe, please have your camera turned on because we want to see your smiling faces. You might want to have a few pieces of blank paper with you in case you want to take notes. When we're in breakout rooms, also again, stay engaged and turn on your camera so that the other participants can see you. It just helps us feel connected and together. When you're not talking, please try to keep your microphone muted. And if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat box or use the modality to be able to raise your hand, and Zach and I will pause and let you talk and ask your question. So be ready to get together and engage in some new learning. Myself, I'm Donna Trujillo. I'm the Vice President of Tiered Services and Special Populations here at Generation Schools Network. I've been with the organization for a little over 4 years now. Prior to that, I was a Director of Special Education for all 90 schools in Douglas County. And my co-host, Zach.
Hi, everybody. I'm a Senior Education Specialist, GSN. I also have my own LLC that I do a strategic prevention work around restorative practices, the trauma stuff, and health and wellness of educators. I also was with Donna in Douglas County as a director there of prevention, where we did a lot of MTSS, prevention, SEL type of stuff. I'm happy to be here with everybody.
From Texas to Oklahoma to Canada to New York, wherever you're joining us from, welcome. So here's what our agenda looks like today. Some introductions and warm up, what our outcomes are, the overview of trauma and the adverse childhood experiences, often called ACEs, neurodevelopment, resilience strategies, and some time for Q&A. So we do know this is a heavy topic, but we are going to be doing some amazing work together today to bring awareness, hope, and empowerment for addressing not only our personal life challenges, but those of our students and others that we interact with on a daily basis. So some outcomes, like I said earlier, we're establishing the foundation of knowledge to understand the complexity of trauma, and we'll be addressing it further in part two. And then we want to talk about and learn why there may be negative outcomes of trauma, kind of dig into what those could look like, might be. And then why you're probably here, most importantly, how to be trauma responsive.
All right. So like Donna said, this is a tough subject. And so, we know anytime we talk about trauma that it may bring up some past trauma, it may bring up some things to you that are hard to deal with. And so we want to honor that and acknowledge that. Sometimes when we're learning about this, I know I've gone through these transitions where there's feelings of guilt or anger, or resentment, or even helplessness, because it's a lot of like tough stuff and a lot of bad news when you're looking at data, around this stuff. So honor that. So we want to take a little bit of time here to set our intention. And I think the biggest thing that I've learned through this and I want to give to other people is just this sense of grace and working on our own grace, having grace for ourselves and grace for others, because it is a very complex subject to learn about, and it has all kinds of depth and all kinds of levels. So if we could we're going to do some mindful breath just to kind of center ourselves here, ground us. And as you're setting that intention of the time together, just think of grace, just do that. So if you would, we're going to just get in a comfortable position. You can close your eyes or just look down. That's fine. Whatever you feel comfortable with. But this is a great mindful breath activity. It helps in all kinds of stressful situations. There's a lot of research behind it. And I like to begin all my kind of meetings and webinars and professional development with this sort of practice. So all I want you to do is just take 5 breaths in and out your nose, full deep breaths, not shallow. And as you're doing that breathing, just set that intention, give yourself grace and grace of others as we explore this topic. So go ahead and begin real quick. 5 quick breaths. Now that can seem like a long time to some people. There's a little science behind this. It's called the 90-second rule. When your brain starts to get stressed and interpret stimuli as stress, cortisol hormone gets released in the brain. And in order for us to become regulated, the science says it takes about 90 seconds for that cortisol to get through us, and so that we can enter back into the thinking part of our brain. So think of it like that. If you can give yourself about 90 seconds worth of some deep breaths, thinking of just a breath or where you're at, it's a really good strategy to help kind of get us regulated so that we can respond to some behaviors or some things that are happening in our lives. All right, we want you to put something in the chat here for us. Just want to get an idea of where everybody's at. We know we've done trauma 1 before. We've done some similar classes with restorative practices. And Don and I really want to see where we're at as a whole group here. Looks like there's like 65 of us. So in the chat, I'm just going to ask the questions in order. If you could really quickly say, hey, I know a little about that. I know quite a bit. I know some, or you guys just sit down, I can teach this. So if you could put that in there, 1, 2, or 3, that would be super helpful for us, and we can monitor the chat as it goes. So first, adverse childhood experiences. What's your current levels of understanding around ACEs and adverse childhood experiences? Awesome. Okay, thank you. Second one, what does it mean? What it means to be trauma informed and trauma responsive? What's your level of understanding there? Okay, good. Brain development. So we're going to go over some basics. We're not, neuropsychs up in here or anything like that, but what's your understanding of brain development, neurodevelopment? Awesome. Okay. And then the last one is those universal supports. So the prevention-based universal supports for students impacted by adverse childhood experience.
Oh, I saw we had a 3, Zach.
Yeah, we got some. So hopefully we have some time. I'd love to know the 3s. Like, what did we miss? I mean, this is so big of a topic. I've so many webinars and classes that I've even attended. And there's always new information coming out and all that. So I'll be
speaking to that, Zach, I forgot to let everyone know at the end of this forum, we will be having a survey link that will drop in the chat for you to fill out, that will allow you to give us feedback about what you loved, what you want to see more of from us. And maybe, like Zach is saying, if you have information to share, we'd love to know that too. And you'll give us your email. We will then provide you with the training certificate for your credits, your continuing education credits. We'll email that to you, as well as all of the presentation materials and recording. Sorry, Zach, I forgot to say that earlier.
Oh yeah, no, perfect. All right, so this is a really important concept to understand for people, especially a lot of the people who are putting ones in there, right? Trauma is measured by impact, not event. The 2s and 3s, I get it. I know you understand this, but just making sure that we understand this, because there's a lot of people, I'm sure, on this webinar that are survivors of adverse childhood experiences. I myself am, right, with 5+ in my childhood. And so it's really important that we understand that it's not the event, because my trauma is not yours, yours isn't mine. And we can sometimes kind of, forget that and pass judgment or do some things around other people's experiences, when there are so many things at play when we talk about adverse childhood experiences. We're talking about age and when maybe that event happened, at what sensitive area of brain development, talking about genetics, disposition of the family, how the family history is, the community history, where you grew up and how that all happened, and how much support there was at those times of those adverse childhood experiences. There's so much that we need that goes into this. So just remember that it's measured by the impact, not the event, right? Okay, I won't go belabor that too much. I think we got to start off. I know all the 3s are like, yes, I've heard about the ACE study. I know this was a thing, right? A big study, but just to get us started, everyone needs to know about it, right? We need to know that there was a big study by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC, and that happened between 1995 and 1997. So a little bit ago. 17,500 plus, mostly white, mostly college educated, middle income, Kaiser HMO members from Southern California were taken in this survey. And what they did is they asked them about their adverse childhood experiences from birth till 18, and then they tracked them for years. So when they took that survey, they were of different ages, but but then they looked at them for years and followed them to get a bunch of data. They asked 10 questions of these people. Okay. So they asked about abuse. Were they physically abused, emotionally abused, sexually abused? Now the questions were a little bit more in depth than that, but then they asked them, were you neglected physically, emotionally? And then they talked about some of the household things that were going on. Was there a mental illness in the family? Like one of your parents or someone that you lived with in the family, did they have mental illness? Was there domestic violence? Was the mother treated badly with that violence in there? Was there a divorce? Was a relative that they were living with incarcerated? And was there substance abuse in the home? So those are the 10 questions that they asked, and then they tracked them to see what that was all about. Oops. What they found out is they did this study and took all this data that they found out that those ACEs disrupted neurodevelopment, right? How the brain architecture was built. It affected how that happened. Then there was the social, emotional, cognitive impairment because of that. And we'll go into more of that when we talk about neural development, just so you know what this study came up with. Then those folks that had all that, there was adoption of health risk behaviors. That had impacts on their life potential. There was disease, disability, and social problems, and early death. And what they found, that was an average of 25 years. Those folks died 25 years earlier than their peers without those adverse childhood experiences. So pretty impactful. I mean, there's been studies and studies, and this has really gotten this field, and I think everyone energized, and doctors and everyone talking about it. So very important. But what questions are left unanswered? What doesn't this study tell us? If there's a couple that want to share, I'd love it. If you want to go into there and raise your hand or just come off mute, I'd love to hear what are your insight on this? What questions were left unanswered, and what didn't that study tell us? Just kind of cruising.
I first noticed that it was limited to Southern California and it was only white people. So that's just a very narrow view of the population. And I think it was a disservice to do the study like that.
Yeah, very, very narrow kind of socioeconomic and demographic study for sure. Anybody else?
May I add to that? Sorry.
Yes, please.
I think that that's a valid point, that it was very narrow, but you would think though that group of people that they interviewed would have higher ACEs. I mean, just looking at the world and their advantage at that time, you would think theirs would be higher. So if theirs is, or lower, excuse me,
yeah.
they need lower scores. So if theirs are that high, then when you factor in poverty and the immigration and race and all the things that are not mentioned that still have that impact, then you've got, it's so much greater. So yeah, we have this little bitty pool, but it's valid information. We just have to expand it and understand that it is so much greater than it shows. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes, thank you. And thank you for both of you. That's great. And that you exactly what we're leading into is yes, right? I mean, that started things off. At least it did that, right? It got the conversation really started, researchers going, doctors talking, and we have now, since the late 90s, have been digging a lot more into this. We know that there are three different, at least now, three different realms of these adverse childhood experiences. It wasn't just those 10 questions. Yes, there are those in that household stuff, right? There's still that stuff to ask. We know those things are going on in homes, and we know it's making an impact, but we also know the community where you're at. You mentioned it: poverty, food scarcity, discrimination, historical trauma. We know that trauma is carried in the genes. It's called epigenetics, and it's actually carried from and inherited generation to generation. Like, that's profound information to know. So the community is a huge piece and a huge source, unfortunately, of adverse childhood experiences. The environment is another one, right? I mean, your house burns down. I mean, think of here in Colorado, we had massive fires a couple of years ago, just south there of Boulder. I mean, how traumatic must that have been for families to lose their everything, right? And if you're a child, think of that, right? Floods that are happening all over. I mean, I just watched a series of, information, saw that somebody in an island in North Australia, I mean, they lost their whole home because the sea levels are rising and it's gone, right? So those are traumatic experiences. And I have it highlighted in red, the pandemic. That was an adverse childhood experience. So think about that context now, because I'm going to share a lot of data with you about stuff, but it's older data. It's just what's out there right now that we can share. But think about what's going on now and the last few years, and it increases adverse childhood experiences, I think. We're going to kind of couch our conversation. We're going to frame it with these four things, and you'll see as we go through how we kind of do that. But to really be trauma informed, I think you need these 4 R's. It's the 4 R's of being trauma informed. We got to realize the widespread impact. So we're going to give you information so you can be like, oh gosh, it is pretty common and there's a wide impact. We're going to help you recognize the signs and symptoms so that we're aware. Awareness is a huge thing. We got to be able to recognize what it is, what's going on with students and families and ourselves. Then we want to be able to respond in a trauma-informed, trauma-responsive way, not react, but respond. And then we want to resist. I think everyone can agree. We want to resist re-traumatization. So how we work with our kiddos and our peers, the systems we set up, the structures that we have, how do we do that in a way that doesn't re-traumatize? Because we don't want to do that for sure. Okay, so some more current information and data from the CDC. 61% had at least one, 16% of adults have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. Females and several racial and ethnic minority groups are at greater risk. And many people do not realize that these ACEs is associated with that health problem. So a lot of people don't make the connection. And we know from the research that, heart disease, cancer, it's all been related to these. And we'll show more information. You'll see that. But just thinking of this data, it's widespread. It's not as uncommon as we think. And I think that's important to understand. This is about in comparison to the whole population. So those people that had adverse childhood experiences, let's look at that first one, have a 54% more likelihood to have current or have depression than someone that didn't. That's all this little blob is showing you. But look at some of these things on here: domestic violence, disability, hopelessness, suicide attempts, drug abuse, right? Look at the numbers there. This is from accumulation of a bunch of data. Now, this you can see is from 2013. So that's not super recent, right? And that's scary, okay? This one says, hey, how could we reduce it? If we were addressing adverse childhood experiences and we're going at it and doing the work and really, trying to fix some of this, then we can have decreases in these things by a lot, right? Cancer, 24.3% is what the data says that we can reduce the chances of cancer. I mean, that's crazy. Cardiovascular disease, right? So a lot of these things that we wouldn't associate necessarily with adverse childhood experiences, but hopefully when we get into the neural development and all that, you'll see why that truly is. But pretty astounding numbers there. Here's something more related to our students. And this was a study in Washington State. You can read through this, but basically they don't do as well in school. I know it's not a super surprise there, but there's a lot of things that are going on, right? When you have a disruption in the neural development, these things happen, okay? And it's really unfortunate. If you look at a classroom, this was a classroom, they did this study again in Washington, I think it was Tacoma. They took a class of 30 and they did a really robust study on what was going on. But for you teachers out there, think about this, think about your classroom, right? And think about like how many, I mean, we always had our bad periods. I can tell you my fourth period, the last year I was teaching, I'll never forget my fourth period class. But think about really how many of those students were, what was really going on in that class. And it might be explained or could shed some light on that maybe what was going on there was there's some kids adversely affected by some of these events, right? I think it helps us not take things as personally. I know it did me when I learned about this, like, okay, I was doing things okay in the classroom. It wasn't my fault. And it's hard to do that as a teacher. I think as an educator, we take a lot of those things very personally. So, but thinking about that, look at the classroom and how that's distributed. There's probably in every classroom out there in America, we know at least one, because pandemic was an adverse childhood experience. But think about it, we have over a 50% divorce rate still in this country. That's an adverse childhood experience. So you can see, so complicate where they grew up, how things were happening in their lives, and you could have more. Okay, I'm going to go through a bunch of slides that really all they do is show a nice progression. The more ACEs, the worse things got. Okay, so this one, suspension, expulsion, and probation. The more ACEs, 5+. Look at the increased prevalence of youth and probation, expulsion, suspension. Here we go. Reoffense and post-probation on their ACE scores. Within 2 years. Again, as the scores go up on ACEs, their percentages increase. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but there's a point to showing all the data. Lifetime history of depression. We're seeing the same trend between men and women. Both of them are increasing. Okay. As the ACEs go up, lifetime history of depression goes up. Drug use by age 14. It's a little weird dip there between 3 and 4, but generally, the more ACEs, the more drug use. A substance use disorder, same thing. With a substance use disorder associated with alcohol. They had it, and then they married into it or married someone with that. More ACEs, the higher the percentage. Teen pregnancy, same. The more ACEs, more percentage of teen pregnancy. And the prevalence of attempted suicide. Okay, so the whole point for all that really quick is there's so much data out there that we can predict what's going to happen, right? The end result is not great when you have children at different areas of sensitivity of their brain development exposed to these adverse childhood experiences. It's predictable. That means it's preventable. So we can get out there, right? We're going to talk about universal stuff, things that we can get out ahead of and do, right? I'm not a trauma therapist. Those people are amazing. And there is that out there. I want to get out ahead of it. We already know it's going to happen. Let's get out ahead. Right, Donna?
Okay, so the adverse childhood experiences, like Zach said, we're aware they're out there, but now we have to recognize the signs. So this graphic, think of the student sitting in the classroom who may be disengaging, maybe having trouble paying attention, maybe just not or outwardly behaving in ways that you're like, what is going on with this child? Those could all be signs, but there's also unrecognizable signs, and we have to be aware of those too. So, as a special educator, I always looked at the child's health history. That's one of the things when you're going through eligibility for an IEP. What's the health history? What's the family history? And a lot of times parents would say, well, why do you need to know that? Because of this. We know that it increases those it can increase those learning problems, their ability to go fight or flight, their ability to attend to things, and their tolerance for difficult situations, which then in turn affects their resiliency. But the good news is children are highly resilient and adaptable if, like Zach said, we get out in front of this. So recognizing our triggers. Oftentimes when we don't understand a behavior, we assume the child is doing it on purpose. We say, why can't you just listen to me? Or if you just do this, if you do this, then. Well, that isn't recognizing the triggers. We have to take a step back, take a moment to understand and consider what other factors may be currently in that child's life that are happening to impact that behavior, but also what may have happened previously. And even like Zach said, even prior to that with their parents, because that genetic involvement. So really understanding the whole scope of that. And common trauma triggers, as we see, are that unpredictable sudden change. If you can set up a system where it's a routine and you give forewarnings of what are happening in your classroom and daily, if there's going to be a change, that can help students feel more comfortable too. We might see that loss of control, students saying that they don't have any friends or that nobody likes them, or they just kind of go off to the side and don't interact a lot. If you try to set a limit on them, you might see an explosion or that retraction into themselves. That sensory overload, so much goes on in our classrooms and our schools every day, even just what's on our walls. If there's too much visual stimulation, we have to consider that too. All that auditory, the movement, the little sounds, the fans going off in the room, those are things that give sensory input. And for students who have trauma triggers or have had traumatic events occur, high ACE scores, or even just students in general, that can impact them. Feeling that sense of loneliness. So it's so important as educators, parents, whoever interacting with those children to really establish that relationship. Get to know them, they get to know you. It's a shared relationship. It's not just you asking them questions, but you sharing too. Hey, if you mess up, own it, right? Teacher with a math problem, does it totally wrong. And then the next day says, oh my gosh, I taught you wrong. That brings togetherness. Owning our behaviors helps those students feel connected and trusted too. And then, of course, like we have a lot in our current culture, a lot of talk about that unfair or unjust. And I always like to talk to my students and even parents I work with about what is unfair and unjust. And one of my favorite quotes is, what is always equal is not always fair. What's always fair is not always equal. So looking at it through, where are we coming from culturally, within our personal experiences, what's important to us, what's happening with society, getting to know each other and relating to each other can help with these triggers. And often when we see a trigger, we see some typical responses. Some people go into that fight mode. They're just going to be aggressive, and a student might run out of the classroom, elope, and you can't get them back. You're like, what just happened out of the blue? Well, something triggered them. What is that trigger? They might fight you. They might freeze just completely. Like my younger one, when he doesn't want to, when he shuts down, I know he's triggered by something. I have to give him time to process and talk. And then submission, that can be a sign too. Somebody who's always like, okay, okay, because they're afraid to trigger you or trigger a situation that becomes a conflict. So you can see here, tying it back, that in classrooms, the students with no ACEs tend to be able to learn better. And also we have to see that we have a large number of students. We have to recognize how many of the students sitting in a classroom of 30 likely have ACE scores. Even one ACE score can be a trigger.
And it's, it's thinking too with that is, instead of asking ourselves saying what's wrong with the kid, it's reframing that and shifting our mindset to what happened to that kiddo.
Yep. So we're going to send you on into breakout rooms so you can interact with a little bit with each other. And Sierra, once we get you into the breakout rooms, we'll drop these questions in. But here's the question that we'll be talking about is, how does this change how you see students, families, yourself, and your community of what you've learned so far? Has this shifted your mindset? If so, if not, in what ways? Okay, so Sierra's gonna place us all in breakout rooms, and Zach and I will be floating between y'all, checking in and seeing if you need anything. What you're thinking. Would anybody be brave enough or willing to kind of take 10, 20 seconds to share out what you guys talked about? I know I heard in the breakout rooms that I joined, it's hard to see when you have 30 students to be able to take that moment and get to know them, or just take that step back and say, wow, what just happened? Yeah. And so sometimes that does have to happen outside or after the fact, to take that moment to reflect on what might have been the case. And finding time to do that in our already busy days can be hard. But even if you can't get with that student, if you can take that time to reflect for yourself, that's helpful too. Anybody have anything else they want to share? You can put it in the chat or unmute yourself about what you all talked about in your breakout room.
Well, we really didn't talk too much, but knowing about the ACEs and those triggers, I think makes you more aware of that child's response, where you're not thinking, children will do well if they want to, but no, children will do well if they can. And also, you interact a lot with parents, and parents become aggressive and all, and you have to take a step back. What might have happened to them? So they have triggers, maybe they didn't have good school experiences. So just walking into the building, or if you have conversations with them and they don't feel empowered, they feel like they've lost control, or they're being attacked, these can all be triggers for them. So instead of taking it personally, like it's a personal attack against you, you have to take that step back and give them a minute, calm down, and you remain real calm with them.
Absolutely. That was excellent point. Yes. And back to that grace thing, have grace for yourself. I messed that up so many times, before I knew much of this. And so it is hard. It's hard not to react when a kid gets in your face and tells you to F off, right? I don't take that really lightly. And it's hard for me not to react, and so it's a lot of growth and a lot of learning this to be able to do that. So well put. And I love the Ross Green quote. Nice job, Jane. All right. We are going to get into this right now. Now, hopefully we've done a decent enough job here really quickly that it's widespread. It's out there, right? There's a lot of stuff going on. Trauma we've recognized or realized that it's widespread. We can recognize some of the signs and symptoms of people and their triggers and their responses. And now we want to get into how do we respond? Again, not react. Exactly what Jane was saying. How do we respond to this instead of the reaction that can easily happen? And I think it helps if we really understand more of the neurodevelopment and the way that the brain works so that we can understand why there is that negative impact. Super quick, guys, again, super easy stuff. Daniel Pink did this hand thing. I'm sure many of you have probably seen it, but here's your brain, right? Here's your brain. Sorry, my thumb's in there. The outside there's the neocortex. That's our thinking brain. Now, a lot of people say that's the thinking brain. That's the cognitive center where we're getting all those synapses and learning and cognition. Inside there, in the middle of the brain, is our limbic brain. That's the emotional or feeling brain, right? And then here's our brain stem, okay? This is our reptilian brain, people, the lizard brain. This is survival brain. Right. This here is where all those first things are being developed. The brain develops from the bottom up. So that's how it happens, because we got to survive first before we can think about doing anything else. Right. So that's the way it goes. So that's the functions of your brain, or your parts of your brain, really quick. If you're a neuro guy, you're probably like, oh, seriously, man, there's like 4 billion structures in the brain. But for us, that's it. This idea. So someone in one of the chats is like, we were talking about how hard it is for people to wrap their heads around this. And we have some difficulty accepting it sometimes. The Frameworks Institute and the Alberta Family Wellness collaborated.
There it
to
is.
create this brain story, right? And they talk about brain architecture.
Yes.
And I love the metaphor. I think it really helps us understand that they aren't just born, right? Brains are not just, you're just like born and you pop out of there and then bam, you got this fully developed brain. That's not how it works. It is built. And early life experiences play a major role in that. And we've seen now some of the effects of what happens, right? The way that the neural pathways are created. There's sensitive at times in a person's brain as we grow and develop, where certain pathways are being created, where some are being pruned, some are being solidified and you know, preparing us for adulthood, you know, about 25-ish. I don't know, my wife might say 40 for men, but you know, 25-ish as a brain fully gets developed. If we look at it this way, here's another picture I like to use to try to explain how it develops. Look on the left there, that's a typical development. When we are born, in a typical development, everything is in a pretty good place. We have caring parents, we've got good communities around us, good supports, all these things are in place. The brain doesn't have to spend a lot of time developing the survival part, right? Because it's there. That we cry, we're fed. We are, you know, cold, we're given a blanket or covered up. These kind of things that were genetically, right, you know, we're engineered, right, to survive. And so we spend, if things are being taken care of, we don't have to spend a lot of time and energy. Those neural pathways are created. We're good. We know we're going to survive. Let's move on to the next thing. Let's look at regulation. Okay. I cry a little more, I'm hungry. You know, it gets to that crazy parenting stage where we have to leave them in the crib and don't go in at night. And I had that timer on freaking me out. Like, oh my God, that's the longest 30 seconds of my life. But we're doing some of these things so that they learn to self-regulate. Okay. In a normal development, hey, good. We got it. We got those neural pathways. We're good to go. Let's move on to learning how to be social and emotional. Starts around that age 3 as a sensitive area. I mean, give or take, but sensitive area in neurodevelopment. We're learning about social and emotional, context and how we relate to people and all those kind of things going on, right? And then about age 4, age 5 is cognition. Now, man, that makes sense. That's about when we start school, isn't it? Our brains are finally getting to that place where we're now developing the pathways for cognition. That's how it would typically work. Let's look at the right side. And on the right side, we got some child that is not in a safe position. The parents maybe aren't healthy. There's things going on in the home. There's a lot of household things, environmental things, who knows what's going on. But if they can't survive and they can't create the neural synapses and pathways for survival, then they're going to keep doing that till they can. Do you see what I'm saying? They got to keep devoting energy and time to building those pathways because they got to survive until they can get to the next thing. And you can see what happens. Age 4, 5, they spend this much time in their brain, in their development, in the architecture, the building of the brain for cognition. And so we wonder, why isn't this kid ready for school? We make a lot of assumptions that kids are ready to learn when they come to our classrooms in preschool or kindergarten or whatever. But look what happens. And you can just take a guess of how that exponentially changes when typical 5-year-olds are learning and doing, and this one is not. And then what happens in third grade? What happens in middle school? What happened, right? There's a huge delay. So there's a lot of things going on with that.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi. I think that a lot of children, I know that a lot of children that I work with, survival should be at the top. And the rest will develop but those students are learning to survive in whatever situations they're in. And
Yep.
so the cognition and the social emotional and the regulation is really difficult sometimes for them because all they're doing is surviving.
That's exactly it. Yep. Thank you. That's perfect. That's exactly what they have to. I mean, they have to devote the time and energy for survival. And it's really unfortunate, but yes. So building a more advanced cognitive, social, and emotional structure, on a weak foundation, can we do it? Yes, we can. That's the hope that Donna was talking about, but it's less effective than if we get it right from the beginning. If we can start the neurodevelopment the way that we would love it to happen, then we can start building onto that cognition, those social and emotional skills. It's like building a house, right? You build a house on sand. Can you keep it up? Sure. You just got to have a bunch of supports in place to keep it there. But if you build a house on a really solid foundation, it's going to stand, and we can keep building better and bigger and cooler, right? We can do it because it has a good foundation. Same sort of metaphor there.
And we as educators can help them build that foundation.
All of us, educators, any positive adult, right? Like that's the wonderful thing. Communities can do this, right? It definitely, we can absolutely change this trajectory for our kids. Serve and return is this idea that there's relationships. So exactly what Donna's saying, we know one caring adult. We've heard that a million times. We know belonging and relationships are the most powerful protective factor that we have. Well, there's in early development, that 2 to 6 year time frame, and then later develop in the adolescence, there's sensitive areas of the brain where kids are trying to communicate something and they're expecting a return, right? Think of it as an early little babies going goo goo gaga, and you say goo 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 ga back, right? It's like, oh, okay, now we're starting to build those neural pathways, those positive relationships, those positive things. As opposed to if you're trying to do those things or trying to say I'm hungry or trying to say I don't feel good and there is no return. Think of it like a tennis game. That's why there's a tennis ball. I serve it and it just goes, right? Then those neural pathways don't get formed, right? And so then we have to start figuring it out, and then different structures start to be built to survive. Back to that point of the surviving. Behavior is communication. A lot of times these kiddos are going to behave in a certain way to communicate a need that is not being met. And we have to be receptive to that. We have to be listening to that and return the serve, right? That positive feedback loop builds the structures in the brain. It helps for sure. All right.
And then we want to make sure that we resist the re-traumatization. So how do we go about this? First and foremost, understanding the different types of stress, not just for the students, but for ourselves too. Then understanding a person's response to the stress. How do I respond to stress? How are they responding to stress? And then understand what stress tolerance is. So let's look at that stress and what it means. So our 3 kinds of stress. We have positive stress in our lives every day. For the most part, maybe not all of us, but for the most part, we have positive stress. Not all stress is bad. Stress can help us grow and learn and expand. And with those caring, supportive adults, some stress helps the young's brains and bodies prepare for future challenges. It builds that resiliency. It builds that adaptability. It helps them understand, I can get over this, or I did this, I went through this, now I know what to do and what not to do. Even meeting new people on the first day of school. Are you excited for that? Are you terrified of it? But meeting new people can be a positive stress that helps us expand our world, and for our students is important to continue. Like Zach said earlier, that foundation of learning from up until 5 is focused on that social emotional and building that social interaction. And so we have to continue growing that in conjunction with everything else we're doing. Performances and competitions can give that too. The next type of stress, so we went from positive to now tolerable. Example, death in the family. We know we're going to have to face death, but for most of us, we can overcome that. And as time goes on, that stress eases. It may be traumatic at first, but we can get through it and past it and work together when we have trusting adults and people in our lives to help us compensate for those feelings and cope with those feelings and develop those skills. And then that can help with the moderation, that tolerable stress then helps us when we get to the next level of stress, which is toxic stress. So examples, again, tying it back to our ACEs, the parental addiction, abuse, neglect, seeing violence, being part of a traumatic experience, those traumatic experiences can have an ongoing and severe effect. And if there's no one around the child to help them through that and calm that, it can harm the architecture of their brain permanently. So I know in the breakout room that I was in, or someone before the breakout room said, what about the parents who don't share? Well, we can't know everything. We can't force people to know everything. All we can do is try. And if we know that that child has been exposed to toxic stress, oh, ding, 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 I might need to watch and dig deeper and watch for some triggers and try to prevent those triggers. And then when we're experiencing stress, again, going back to that brain, that stress starts in the cortex. When that cortisol gets released, you got to give yourself the time and have the skills to be able to de-stress or calm yourself. And if that doesn't happen, it overloads and moves to the lower parts of our brain that then brings us back to your survival brain. And how does this all tie into school and children? Well, just like the air traffic controller, trying to manage all the planes in the sky, trying to manage the communication coming in and trying to send communication out and keep everything safe and everyone safe, our brain acts the same way every day. So youth need to be able to understand how to organize themselves, how to organize their day, and build that foundation of executive functioning to even be able to interact with each other. And when we have those demands placed on our brain, everything's flying in and out. How do we hold it? What do we do with it? How do we plan our next steps so we don't just get stuck in that fight, flight, freeze mode? And we also want to be able to understand that with all of this, as we're learning these skills, it will help us build that foundation of the brain's architecture so that the pyramid is not just a big bottom of survival, but we open up the students' minds and learning to be able to then build that foundation that Zach said is not like sand, but is supported and or solid. So some executive functioning, what happens when the air traffic control isn't working? What happens to those students? I know in students that I work with, they tend to shut down or start calling themselves stupid, start thinking that they're not good enough. And we have to find ways to get them out of their survival brain and move them into their thinking and learning brain, helping them take a step back, reset, take a breath, and then plan next steps, not overloading them with a bunch of information when they're already triggered or stressed. Simple things like the routine, forewarnings, providing them examples of work before they start working on it. providing them with an example of a math problem for their homework so that they can refer back to that math problem of how it looks and what to do. That can help with executive functioning. The smallest strategies can keep us out of that stress brain, help our brains control, and move us into that thinking and learning brain. And then we have our window of stress tolerance. So if you think about a window opening or shutting, okay, when your window is closing, you can feel regulated and secure. It's protecting you from the outside elements. If a little breeze comes in, you're not going to freak out. But when we're in a toxic stress, our window of tolerance decreases and opens up. And that wind and all the storm can blow in and you can feel like you can't stop it. So we have to really work with our students and for ourselves too, to keep that window of tolerance bigger so that we can then weather the gusts that come in and toward us. Hi guys, we're just, we're gonna get the presentation back up, but while we're waiting for, Zach got it. I heard some really interesting things in the breakout rooms that I was in and would love, can anybody share some of their discussion? Just quick tidbit.
I think something that we talked about, and this is something I have thought of since my courses first went over ACEs, is that it is kind of frustrating and it feels a little bit hopeless to hear about these things that are caused by systemic and policy issues. And you have to, and it, because of the failures of a system, not the burden, but it is a hat that the teacher ends up having to wear, and it's unfortunate. And it feels like you wish that you could do more on a larger scale level, because these are things that, you know, are failures of policy if they're at such a high rate, especially related to poverty and food insecurity. And I think that makes it, it's hard, it's difficult to know that a lot of this is preventable, but it's just the way it is for now.
Yeah.
Extremely hard.
And when you start thinking about this, it sounds like you are thinking like I do. It's like how you start getting overwhelmed. Like, how can I fix this? How can I do that? And you just got to take that breath and say, start with me. And I know one of our other rooms was talking about that. If you can't start with yourself and be ready for yourself, then how can you be ready for your students? So just start with you and try not to overwhelm. Take care of yourself as much as you can first to then be able to take even just one student at a time or one piece of stress at a time.
Yeah. Pick one easy strategy that you know can maybe make a difference. It's all back to that grace, that intention of grace, because I've so many times doing this work, do I feel just hopeless and helpless, you know, and that's hard. It's really hard.
One of my coworkers always tells me it's a bad day, not a bad life.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, my husband and I own a restaurant, and a customer yesterday came in and he was talking to us and he said, so many people look back on what they should or would have done differently, not realizing that you can't change that, rather than looking at what am I going to do today? And not even looking at what am I going to do next year, but let's focus on what we can do today. And I thought that hit me yesterday when he said that. I was like, he's right. It kind of brought me back to reality.
So let's talk a little more positive, maybe that we can now get into maybe some strategies or some thinking about resilience, because I think when we start talking about resilience, for some reason that's like, oh yeah, I can totally do that. I can totally relate to resilience, and that sounds a lot more positive than this other stuff we're talking about. And it's 100% related to this trauma informed and being trauma responsive. So I got a little quiz from you, just for yourself. You don't have to put it in the chat, but yes or no questions. Is resilience something a person is born with? Is resilience influenced by experiences? Is resilience something that can be learned? And is resilience something that can be changed? If you answered yes to all of these, good job. Because the answer is yes to all those. And that's the hope, right? We're going to talk about it. Good job, everybody. I love this. I love Alberta Family Wellness and the Frameworks Institute for coming up with these cool metaphors that helps us understand and like visualize. I'm such a visual learner. So like I took this course and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm using some of these things. So let's think of resilience as a resilience scale. We got the lever, we got the fulcrum, we got negative experiences and positive supports, right? This is important because I think in one of our groups, people were talking a little bit about this in the first one, about this understanding of adverse childhood experiences and how it affects the brains, and all our cultural models that we have out there, especially here in America, around things like, pull you up by your bootstraps, and that which doesn't kill you only makes you stronger, and I know all kinds of people, and I had it hard, and man, look what I did with myself. And those are all great, right? That's a lot of foundational cultural things that we believe in, and I think that is all can be true also. Like there's truth in that, but there's also understanding that it's a little bit more complicated than that. And hopefully that's something that we're understanding here, is that there's still things that go on. The brain is not born, right? It's created, it's made by experiences. And those sensitive times in people's lives, in especially early childhood and adolescence, really plays a huge factor on what neural pathways are being solidified, like really created hard, and the other ones being pruned away, right? Do I have to devote everything to just surviving? So every stress that I have, I go to my survival brain. And if that's what happens, the survival brain, you guys saw, that's not the cognitive, that's not me thinking. So when something happens in a classroom and I say, take out a pencil, and the kid loses it, throws his desk and runs out of the class, that's not thinking brain. I mean, come on. They're not like sitting there for a second going, I wonder if maybe I should throw my desk, call the teacher a bad name, and run out of here. Yeah, no, wait. Yeah, no, I think that's the idea. That's what I'm going to do. No, it's bam, man. It's like you see a snake and you jump, right? Something triggered the survival brain. Why? Because those neural pathways that were so solid and so ingrained that when experiencing a stress, that window of stress tolerance, they didn't have any more tolerance. It was gone. And so they blew, right? So this resilience scale, right? We can see how, hey, it's not just about like, I experienced those bad things. There's a scale, right? And there's positive sports and negative sports. And this factors in how resilient we are to life, to stress, to everyday things, right? And how successful we're going to be in the world, right? It doesn't mean bad things happen. You're now, oh my gosh, you're never going to make it. No. Yes, we can. And as a community, we can come together, and we're skills and strategies we can do to help, for sure. All right. So when you look at it, and the lever tilts to the negative. So the negative experiences carry more weight in this example, in this person's, then what you get is those negative outcomes. All those things that the CDC had in the research had, that we know, incarceration, teen pregnancy, substance abuse disorder, like all kinds of these things, right? Not negative life outcomes, bam, when they have more weight, and you're going to be less resilient. But the other way the scale works, if you have more positive supports, right? The good things, and maybe it is starting at the beginning of neural development, where it was just a good, solid environment for the child to grow. Or maybe some stuff happened, but there was all these positive supports that came around. Then we tip that scale now to positive life outcomes. Okay, well, this is what we want, right? We want people to be in the positive outcome. We want more jobs, we want good health, low crime. I mean, this is what we want as a society. I think pretty much any society probably wants these same things. So we want to have that. We want the positive supports to tilt our scale to that way, right? So though, how much leverage does toxic stress have? It definitely does, because remember, the toxic stress interrupts neural development. Okay. And that's the fulcrum piece of this. So yes, we have the lever, cool, but we have the fulcrum, which plays a pivotal role in this. And that fulcrum is our capacity for resilience. So toxic stress, a lot of it in those sensitive times in a person's life, can shift that to that bottom down there. It can shift that fulcrum to the right, to being less resilient. Again, like I said before, genetics has a role in this, the community in which you were part of, raised in, the different life experiences, the environment, the pandemic, like how all that happened. It can shift your fulcrum to being less resilient. All those have a factor. Or you can shift a fulcrum to be more resilient. It matters. That starting point matters for sure. That's why when we talk about brain architecture and we say building it on a solid early foundation it's much more successful. It's much more easy to do it. Not that we can't, but it's just easier, right? Because that's our starting point in this lever, in this scale. So if we have, given everything's equal, say negative and positive supports and negative experience balance each other out. But if I have less capacity to be resilient because of the way toxic stress may have impacted my neural development, then I give more weight, I give more leverage, or the negative experiences have more leverage in my life. You see how it tips the scale. Doesn't even matter that it's even, it's just because that's my starting point. I've had talks with a lot of school leaders and administrators that talk about, oh man, I'm doing all these things to build staff morale, and I'm, giving people time to voice their opinions and meet me in the office and all these things and all this, and I'm doing whatever I can, and like it still doesn't matter to everybody, to some people. Well, given all things equal, let's take a different view of that and see where were people's starting points, right? We know that educators are the most stressed out profession in the United States right now, since 2014. That was pre-pandemic, okay? So we know that. And let's see where our starting point is. And so you might be doing everything you can, and it's just you're not seeing the benefits. Maybe it's because that fulcrum is off for people, and it's going to require a little more support. If we are starting off at a starting point more resilient, awesome, right? Our neurodevelopment was right on track. Things are going good. It got lots of positive supports. Guess what? Life happens, right? Bad things happen. I mean, we talked about death in the family, loss of job. Things happen. Well, how come some people are able to overcome those, be more resilient? It has a lot to do with their starting point. Right? They already were given that advantage. So the negative things that are happening in their life, they don't have as much leverage. They can deal with them to a point. Obviously, you get enough of them and that scale is going to tip. But because of that early great foundation, I'm able to deal with some of these hard things. And so when you're saying, oh, I know a guy that, he's gone through some tough times and look at him now, he's got his own business, he's doing all these great things. That's super awesome. I'm sure they worked incredibly hard, but possibly also they had a better starting point in all that to be able to take on that adversity, to have those skills, that executive functioning, to manage all that, all those kind of things that were built in those sensitive times of brain development. The good news is, right, if we're less resilient, does that mean, oh, well, just write them off? There's nothing, if that happened to us. No, I hope we don't do that. I think there's a lot of us on this call that had adverse childhood experiences, and we've made it. And that's because there were people around us, probably, I know that's my personal experience, that moved my fulcrum. I had supports in place. I had really amazing teachers at one point in my life that were like critical to my development as a 5th and 6th grader, and when things were really bad, right? And that was support that I needed. I had grandparents that were solid and safe, right? And so what they do is they start to move the fulcrum. They can move it. I can get those supports and they move it, and I can get to be more resilient. And I think that's the message that we want to send out there, is that, yeah, it's easy for us to feel helpless and hopeless. I know that, but there are definitely things that we can do. And I think anytime, we're there and we're supporting, right? Putting more positive supports, the one caring adult, we know how important that one care. We know the research is really clear about the one caring adult and all the things that it can do to build resilience. Remember this slide where we looked at where the whole continuum goes, right? Thinking about your role with kids, if whether you're an educator, maybe a social worker or psych or something like that, if you're, whatever your role is, where do you fit into this equation? Okay, if we're looking at the left, we have different points to where we can intercede, where we can provide supports. It goes back to, if it's predictable, it's predictable, it's preventable. We know this is going to happen with kiddos that have to go through adverse childhood experiences without supports. This is the trajectory. So where do we fit in this? What roles do schools play? What role does the community play in this? And I know there's policies and all that. I don't want you to feel, again, that kind of hopelessness in this, but where can you make the difference? So just kind of think of where that is. And I know in our lens on this and trying to teach us is way up front, right? Way up there. But some of you are maybe, like Donna said, special educators. And so you're hitting them there. Some people work in juvenile justice maybe on this call. And so you're working there. But I hope there's enough of us that we can get way out in front of that. Just curious, does anybody know, you can come off, anyone know where the most money is actually spent in our society for this work?
Prison systems?
Yeah, on the very right side of all, like as we go through, yep, the most money is, there's a stat out there now about incarcerated youth, that it spends about $588 a day. So that's $214,620 a child for a person that's in confinement, a young person, as opposed to only $100,000 on a 4-year degree average. That's a lot. Over $200,000 in 1 year as opposed to a 4-year degree. So yeah, I think that's what we can do as educators. Want to get into some quick strategies. I said this before, I can't say it again, as we talk and we're just in this trauma 1 teaching. If we do nothing else, how do we help young people feel like they belong? How do we ensure their dignity is intact? That means that inherent self-worth of who they are, how they identify, how is that person held up, felt like they belong, they're accepted, that we help them build relationships, that we form relationships with them as the adult. We have connections, and then we try to have them have connections with positive things, positive curricular, things, academics or activities or something in the school. How do we give a young person purpose? How do we share power in a classroom so they feel like they have a job in the classroom? These are things that, if you look at yourself as an adult, what makes me feel belonging, like I belong in this school or in this job or in this clinic? Probably things around this is how I feel like I belong. Am I valued? Do I know that they value me? Do I have purpose? Young people want this same thing. This is, if you do nothing else, consider these things on how to help kiddos belong. And that does amazing things. Okay, just quickly, because I know we're running out of time, but a bunch here, here's just I just like puked on the page here. There's a lot of different prevention-based things that I think educators can do, right? SEL, social emotional learning. If you didn't hear me say it in there, I mean, I think you would have heard it, right? That work is incredible about building relationships, being aware of themselves, how to manage those emotions. I would go one step further and say, first, as an adult, do you practice that? Are you aware of your own emotions? Can you manage those, right? How are your relationships? How do you build them? Do you model that? Kids are amazing in school. When they see infighting and all these kind of things going on in buildings between adults, they notice, right? We are huge. We can model this. This is important stuff. Circles. If you do circles, check-in circles, morning meetings. Okay, I know there's a lot to those to do those effectively. I don't want you to just do them willy-nilly, but do some research. That's great. It creates belonging in a classroom. It shares power. There's so many incredible things around that. Related to that, restorative discipline, restorative practices. There's so many things in that. The kids are going to mess up. There's going to be harm and conflict. How do you deal with that in a trauma-informed? Restorative practices is trauma-informed. It is also social emotional learning, right? It's great stuff. Simple stuff. Donna mentioned this, the predictability. How can you be more predictable for a kiddo in a classroom? An agenda on the board. Hey, there's going to be a fire alarm in a couple of days. Let's prepare for that, because we all know the kiddos that is completely, they just become completely dysregulated because of some things like that, right? When they think something's going to happen and then it changes, That's a deal breaker. That's that stress, that window of stress tolerance, right? I'm dealing with a lot of stuff, but that's it. I'm over my limit now and I'm going to freak out. Simple, an agenda. What are we doing today? Here's what it looks like. Remember, a kid impacted by adverse childhood experiences, that household was not a very predictable place. So you can see how that could be a trigger. So it's very, as much as, and this is good for all kids, by the way. This isn't just for and you don't even know who the trauma kids are, but kids impacted by adverse childhood experiences, right? This is good for all kids. Regulation space. Is there a place in your room where a kid can go when they're dysregulated? Do you teach them how to use it? Do you teach them how to use regulation tools? Some people call them fidget toys, but I don't think they're toys, right? What is something that helps them? A regulation room, that's big in the school, like a place that you've just created that the kids can get out of the classroom if they need to, because they're feeling the triggers, they're feeling it. You're helping them become more aware and manage, and they go to that place that's supported by an adult. An amazing thing. We called it a home base. Again, I said regulation tools, the organized, I think Donna said this exactly, right? What your room looks, what's on the walls. Sensory overload is a thing, right? Be aware of that. Like if you notice kids being dysregulated because of that, then might want to do something. But just clutter. Think of a really chaotic home life. Probably not a lot of organization. It's probably like just kind of crazy. That is something that we can easily do. Flexible seating, right? To a limit. I know we got to manage behaviors and stuff, but like my son, it's in his 504. He has to be able to stand up. He gets a wobble chair. These kind of things are really helpful for kids to regulate and keep that regulation and keep the stress level down. Right? Can they lay on their belly and do their work? Why not? Right? They don't all have to sit in perfect, like flexible seating. Healthy snacks. Oh my goodness. Sugar, the enemy, right? Like a bunch of sugary stuff and they're popping that stuff in. Oh my gosh, guys, candy bars. And I know we all like to give little treats and candy, and kids love candy, but for kiddos that struggle with regulation, not the best, right? So healthy snacks are great and keep kids regular. Lots of water. That's great. Movement. Oh my gosh, we've heard this a million times. Are we taking breaks so kids can move and get up and do something, right? It's important. I think they said this at the beginning, but if you're not caring for yourself, to put the whole oxygen mask on first before your kids sit next to you on the airplane type of thing. Yeah. I mean, it's so hard to stay regulated in this profession. And when we're dealing with hard things like this, secondary traumatic stress syndrome is a real thing, right? When we're dealing and working with kiddos in hard situations, it's like swimming and not getting wet. You're going to get wet. It's going to impact you. If you're not mentally healthy, physically healthy, taking care of yourself, it's not selfish. It's absolutely imperative. You got to be ready to take on this stuff. And then modeling that. So part of that self-care is then modeling it. Kids see you eating healthy snacks. Kids see you drinking water. Kids see you taking a mindful breath. Like, guys, I'm getting super stressed. I need a break. We all need to get up and move. All those things are awesome, right? And it's really effective. And then there's this thing called Handle with Care. I don't know if any of you've heard this, but it's a great thing to work with. It's a very trauma-informed program to work with law enforcement, local community, to let schools know that something happened the night before. So just having an awareness that, man, there might have been something at that house and that kid's coming to school with it. No information, just handle with care. Handle Zach with care today. Something happened. I don't need details, but I know I better watch out for him. So that's something that, more of a tier 2, but it's something that schools can engage into.
Okay, we're coming up on time, but
Yes.
Real quick, I just want to tie in something that I teach my parents and the teachers in schools that I work with, is if you have a student with an IEP or a 504, look at those accommodations and try to see how you could implement it for all your students. Because a lot of those accommodations that help one student help the other students, and also help you as a teacher alleviate the stress and management within your classroom. So we're going to move on. We'll give you time for Q&A, but while we're taking questions, Sierra is going to put the feedback survey in the chat. If you could please click on that link and fill that out, that will allow you to get the materials from today and also for us to send you your certificate for those continuing education credits. And then you asked how to sign up for the rest of the workshops. We will be showing you that in a second. We have our next forum, Zach, I can't remember. It was a Thursday in February. It's February
Right there.
16th.
Yeah.
Yep. And so you can go on our Generation Schools website, go to Social Emotional or SEL, and then it'll be a link for upcoming events. And then next slide. I just want to say real quick, a lot of you expressed, how do I do this with just me? This is what we're here for. As GSN, we get grant and private donor funding for schools and districts around the nation. And if you have interest in working with us to bring this to your whole school, your whole district, or just a set of teachers, please reach out to Zach or me, and we can start looking at funding and setting up ways to come in and support you for anything you need. We have a wide depth of knowledge in our team at GSN and lots of community partners to be able to support you in anything that you need. We mentioned one person, but with GSN, with us, you don't have one person, it's a whole team. And we bring in the community, the parents, the student voices, everyone together through our grant programming. Here, when you get the presentation, will be links to some of the resources that you can delve into further. And last but not least, Zach, next page. There's our contact information again. Zach and I are here to support you. And if we don't have the answer, like I said, we have people who will get the answer.
Yes.
So thank you for your time today. While Zach, Sierra, and I are going to hang out for a little while to take any questions that you have. So as you complete the survey, feel free to drop off, and we'll look forward to seeing you hopefully at our next training for trauma-informed teaching too.
Thank you guys so much. This was really awesome. I really appreciate you doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you. I know it was a lot. It's a lot of information. So
And
thanks
we
for hanging
always
in.
get nervous. We're like, is anyone even going to come? Is anyone going to show us? So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. It was great.
You're welcome.
Have a good night, everyone.
Hi,
Thanks
everyone.
for joining.
Do y'all have like a book or something where we could go back and review all of this?
Yeah, you'll be getting the presentation materials from today. And if you have questions or want more learning, feel free to reach out to Zach and or me, and we'll connect with you directly.
Yeah, there's a lot of books and stuff we could recommend, and those resources that we linked on that resource page are actually, they're pretty amazing. So
Okay.
you can get a lot from them. Yeah.
Okay.
Is part of the resources you said that'll be included, or is there a way to get a recording of?
Yep. That'll all be sent. The PowerPoint presentation with the links to the resources, the recording of the presentation, as well as your certificate.
All right, thank you so much.